from Fox News in Washington. President Biden is out with a huge spending plan, saying he'll tax the rich to pay for it. Republicans say tax hikes are out of the question, but they haven't released their own plans just yet. This year's budget fight carries high stakes because right now Washington is also facing a deadline to approve a new borrowing limit or risk huge economic consequences. Joining us now to discuss it all, Louisiana Senator John Kennedy, member of the Senate Budget Committee, who is known for his colorful commentary on this issue and many others. Senator, welcome back to Fox News Sunday.
Thank you.
All right, let's start here. The president makes his pitch this week for the budget and says this.
My plan is going to reduce the deficit by $3 trillion over 10 years. Based on what we know so far about their plan, it's going to explode the deficit by more than $3 trillion over the next 10 years. They want to cut tax for the wealthy and large corporations, take away the power we just gave Medicare to negotiate lower drug prices.
All right, Senator, he says he's going to reduce the deficit, shore up Medicaid and Social Security, and make the rich pay their fair share. So what is the GOP counter?
The president's budget took my breath away. His numbers are extraordinary. We're going to run out of digits here. It's a $6.9 trillion budget, $4.7 trillion in new taxes that will affect everyone over 10 years, $18 trillion in new debt, a cut to defense. The president says that his budget will solve our financial problems in Medicare and Social Security. That's not true. Anything seems possible when you don't know what you're talking about. The Wall Street Journal just reported that the president's budget will add $11 trillion in a financial shortfall to Social Security and Medicare. The only way I know how to improve the president's budget is with a shredder.
Well, we're waiting to see what Republicans, though, want to offer in return, other than just criticism. Here's what the New York Times says, how they characterize what they say is coming. They say hard-right House Republicans are readying a plan to gut the nation's foreign aid budget and make deep cuts to health care, food assistance, and housing programs for poor Americans. So, again, we got to get to what the GOP counter is, and how do you also deal with the optics of knowing how the Republican plans are going to be portrayed by most folks in the media?
Well, I'm going to try to do what's right for the American people. The media can do what it wants. The House is on its track to put together a budget, Shannon. The Senate needs to be doing its work on the budget. Senator Schumer has prevented that. I'm on the Appropriations Committee. We should be meeting right now. As you know, we split the budget up into 12 mini budgets. I'm ranking member on one of those subcommittees. We should be meeting right now, talking about how to reduce the rate of growth of spending and debt accumulation, but Senator Schumer will not allow us to meet. So when you can't sit down with your colleagues, it's kind of hard to put together something to talk to the American people about. But there's no question that there are savings to be had in this budget. No fair-minded American believes that you can't find efficiencies in a $6.9 trillion budget.
So you mentioned spending, and that is something we are hearing from House Republicans. Speaker McCarthy out there saying we're bringing in all-time highs of revenues, but we have to talk about cuts in spending. But a CBO analysis says this: Republicans don't exactly have clean hands on that issue. Republicans bear at least equal blame as Democrats for the biggest drivers of federal debt growth that passed Congress over the last two presidential administrations. So how do you convince your party to stop spending in the same way that Republicans criticize Democrats are doing?
Well, that criticism that you just read is correct. There have been any number of bills passed with Republican support in the Senate that added to spending. I didn't vote for them. I'll give you one example. We just passed a $40 billion subsidy for big tech. It's called the CHIPS bill. The idea is to bring semiconductor manufacturing back to America. Right now we have a 10% market share. We just spent $40 billion in a giveaway to big tech. You know how much it's going to increase our market share? 1%. our infrastructure bill, which is not really an infrastructure bill. I didn't vote for it because I'm not going to buy a car to get the cup holders. If you want to talk savings, we ought to stop sending checks to dead people. We spend about $1 billion to $2 billion every year to send money to dead people. The checks are being cashed. It's obviously fraud. The president's plan to have the American people pay for student debt costs $400 billion on over 10 years. We already had a plan to repay student debt. It's called a job. We ought to get rid of that. We ought to talk about how to reduce the federal workforce through attrition. We ought to talk about why in the Medicare program we're paying more for the same surgical treatment in a hospital as opposed to an outpatient clinic. There are lots of things we can do to reduce spending in this budget, but on the Senate side, we have to have Senator Schumer's permission to do that, and he's not going to give it, nor is President Biden.
Well, the White House does say they're folding in, I guess, $1.6 billion that will be aimed at fraud and going after things that you mentioned. And of course, we're waiting to see what the Supreme Court says about the executive decision on forgiving student loans. So we'll stand by on those. Meantime, entitlements are getting a lot of attention. Republicans have repeatedly said they're not going to cut them. The White House has repeatedly said you need to be afraid if you're getting these benefits. Here is what GOP presidential candidate Nikki Haley said this week.
We have to be realistic. It is unrealistic to say you're not going to touch entitlements.
Okay. They say Democrats are actually making proposals about these entitlements, but they say this: if Republicans continue to stubbornly insist that Social Security and Medicare shouldn't be touched, the inevitable result will be not only that Democrats win the political debate, but that all such reforms will mostly mean higher taxes. So listen, trustees of these programs tell us 10 to 15 years, they'll be insolvent. Nikki Haley's out there saying you got to talk about it, but Republicans are, chastised every time you do. Should you be having a public conversation about those things?
Well, I think you ought to get the Social Security that you paid for, and I think you ought to get the Medicare that you paid for. Now, Medicare is going to start getting in trouble financially in 2028. Social Security in 2035, I think. We should be talking now how to make sure that those programs are solvent. The problem is that President Biden, in his State of the Union address, decided to demagogue the issue. We all saw it. He basically said, if you speaking to Republicans, if you talk about Social Security or Medicare, I'm going to call you a mean, bad person. And that just took the issue off the table when the president decided to demagogue it. It was, you can only be young once, but you can always be immature. And I thought it was a very immature thing to do.
So you think there need to be conversations then about something, whether it's changing the age for people who are not yet paying into these benefits, future changes, current changes?
Well, of course we ought to talk about it. I mean, the life expectancy of the average American right now is about 77 years old. For people who are in their 20s, their life expectancy will probably be 85 to 90. Does it really make sense to allow someone who's in their 20s today to retire at 62? Those are the kind of things that we should talk about. There are changes in Medicare we should talk about. Let me say it again. Medicare pays much more for the same surgical procedure in a hospital as it does in a private outpatient clinic. Why? There are a lot of things we could talk about, but President Biden has taken that issue totally off the table. He says he has fixed it in his budget. And that's nonsense. That's nonsense on a stick.
It looks like that's going to be done through increased taxes, which I know Republicans are thumbs down on that. I want to ask you about the border quickly.
But it still leaves a shortfall. It still leaves $11 trillion shortfall. So when the president says I fixed the problem, with all due respect, he's not telling the truth.
Yeah, there is definitely a debt component to what he's proposing out there that's pretty hefty. I want to ask you about the border because there's talk of taking cartels, designating them as foreign terrorist organizations. There's also talk about whether or not you get the U.S. military involved. Former AG Bill Barr's got a very interesting piece in the Wall Street Journal where he talks about if our country is under threat, we should have operations, including within Mexico. Where do you stand on that?
I think Attorney General Barr is correct. Look, the cartels, we know who they are. They're killing Americans on both sides of the border. And the fact is that the American military could partner with the Mexican military and the Mexican police, and we could wipe out the cartels. But President Lopez Obrador in Mexico refuses to do that. And when Senator Graham and I talked about the issue this week, President Biden said it was a bad idea. And the truth is that President Biden believes in open borders. The cartels don't seem to bother him. And President Lopez Obrador, he can answer for himself. But I don't understand why he would turn down American help to get rid of cartels that are killing his people and our people.
Just very quickly, to be clear, if the U.S. wasn't in a partnership of some kind with Mexico, its military, its law enforcement, does the U.S. military have any role within Mexico, short of that cooperation?
No, we can't. No, we can't go into Mexico without Mexico's permission.
Just want to be clear. All right, Senator Kennedy, great to see you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shannon.
This week.